Thank you, and hello everyone. Appreciate you joining us today. It's been a few months since we did our last webinar, and hopefully everyone has had a good summer, at least those in the Northern Hemisphere. Excited for today's topic because we're going to dive into the area of how to get breakthrough thinking as you're doing organization design work. And hopefully we've got a combination today of participants that are both executives who are trying to figure out competitive issues in their organizations, as well as practitioners who are trying to help think about how to facilitate their organizations through breakthrough organization design efforts. And so today we're really going to dive into the area of some micro skills, if you will, some things that are probably a bit more nuanced about how to think about issues and competitive matters a little bit differently. And so hopefully this will be a discussion that will spur some new insights for you, and certainly as Vonnie indicated, really appreciate questions throughout. That'll allow me to know if we're hitting the mark and if there are things that we can expand on that will give you some insights. Now, for those that are new to our webinars, I'd like to give just a little bit of a background as to who AlignOrg Solutions is, what we do. We're a niche consulting firm that specializes in helping organizations clarify their strategy and the implications of it for their organization, diagnose the capabilities in their organization so that they can assess whether or not their organization is capable of delivering on their strategic promise. We deal obviously in organization design and alignment, and we do work in change management as we help organizations implement the changes that they want to instill. We do a lot of capability building. Good 20% of our practice is helping professionals and executives gain the capabilities, skills, methodologies, and tools that are necessary to really drive transformative change in an organization. And the bulk of our business is really working on projects. And so we consider ourselves practitioners first, who are trying to help others gain the same skills and knowledge that we have so that they can benefit their organizations. And that's really what we do. At some point in the future, if you're interested, we'd be excited to tell you about a new training platform that we're getting ready to launch soon, which will enhance our capability building efforts for organizations that are trying to build organization design muscle internally. So we'll talk more about that in future discussions. So that's kind of the setup. As we go through our webinar today, we always like to share stories. Some stories may come from a few of the organizations noted here. Some of these organizations we've had the privilege of working with. Others are ones that we read about in the paper, in the media. And regardless of how we intersect with organizations, we find it's beneficial to pick up learnings and pass those along through the stories that we tell. And hopefully you've got some of your own stories and that those stories are becoming compelling as you try to influence people in your organizations. So let's dive into today's topic. The challenge really that we're trying to tackle today is when you get in a room and you've got a bunch of bright leaders or executives sitting around a table trying to figure out, can our organization in fact deliver on the competitive direction that they want to take the organization? There's always this stumbling block, if you will, which is, are we really being innovative and breakthrough in the way we're thinking about the problem? And this quote, supposedly attributed to Albert Einstein, says, we can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. And if you think about it, when we gather together to solve an organization design problem, we really are taking the people and the thinking of those people that has traditionally prevailed in the organization, and we've said, now we want you to think differently. And that's not necessarily a bad thing to ask them to do. We all have to evolve and change as conditions and market conditions change. But that's a tough thing to do because the things that have made us successful have informed our thinking and now in some ways have become the very inhibitors to being able to break out of our current paradigms and think differently. Now, sometimes we can change that dynamic by bringing new players around the table. Sometimes we can, certainly bring experts in who know things that we don't know and can spur some thinking that way. But often we are really stuck by the kind of thinking that we used when we first created our organizations. We often say in our business that organizations are a reflection of the collective thinking and logic of the people who work there. Why do we organize around customers? Well, because we think doing that is going to help us. And if we thought something else would, we would change our minds and we would consider organizing around geographies or around product groups or something else. But we use this logic that we believe is going to lead us to success. And so when it comes time to change that, we're sometimes stuck because what we thought was so successful before may not be the answer, and yet we don't know what the answer should be. Now, when we dive into our book, Mastering the Cube, there's a couple of principles that stand out, and just want to quickly highlight these because these, in a sense, start to underpin what we need to try to solve for here. When you're doing organization design work, and if you're familiar with our book, we equate an organization to a Rubik's Cube. I know that seems a little juvenile, but the point is that an organization is a complex puzzle, much like the Rubik's Cube. And if you adjust one part of the Rubik's Cube, it has residual or ancillary effects to other parts of the Rubik's Cube, just like when in an organization you change one thing, it has an effect elsewhere. So the first principle is if work doesn't change, results aren't going to change. Now that might seem incredibly obvious, but that's one of the things that ultimately has to underpin an organization transformation effort is we have to change the way work's being done. The second is differentiating activities allow us to deliver strategic differentiation. So if the work doesn't change, that's one thing, but if we can't find the differentiating work and find a way to deliver that effectively, then we'll never be able to stand out in our marketplace. The next principle is the ability to compete lies in the activities you choose to do and how you resource them. So if I try to do the same work the same way I've always done it, I'm not going to stand out and I'm not going to be in the best position necessarily to compete, which is why strategy drives work and thus work drives structure. So we use these principles, and many others, of course, to start to set the stage for why it's so important to be innovative in the way that we think about our organizations and how we set them up, how we resource them, and how we help them deliver value. And as I go around and work in a lot of different types of organizations, some of them are industrial, some are financial services, some are high tech, some are in healthcare, whatever the business or industry, the challenge is, in a sense, much the same. How do we take the limited resources we have, put them on the work and the activities that are going to best deliver differentiation, and then help make sure everything else in the organization is lined up to deliver that? Those are the things that we're really trying to do. And so as we've sat in rooms with countless groups of executives, we found that there are a few things that can really lead to some breakthrough thinking. And we've bucketed these into sort of three categories, and we're going to cover each of these. The first one is if you've got to facilitate or find a way to facilitate a change in mindset. This goes back to the idea that the logic that we've used to be successful up to this point may not be the same logic we need in the future. So how do I shift that mindset? The second is, how do I start to use and or adopt frame-changing models? Now, don't confuse here a frame-changing model with complex or complexity. A simple framework can sometimes change radically the way that people view issues. And so let's talk about some ways that we've seen this happen. And the third component of this is, how do we begin to get leaders and executives to lead in such a way that they begin to encourage, foster, and facilitate insight-producing behaviors and thinking in their organization? So those are the categories we want to try to cover today. So let's dive in here. We're going to start with the facilitating mindset shifts. The logic goes that the same old thinking is going to get us the same old results. We've talked about this. So how do we do something different? Well, let me put out a formula. And if you've joined us on previous webinars, you've probably seen something to this effect. But there is a connection between an organization's strategy, the organization capabilities, we often refer to them as the organizational muscles that are needed to compete, and the detailed organization choices that will help drive performance. And you'll notice I've got a blowout here of our Rubik's Cube that we talk about in our book, and that's how we begin to drive into the actual choices. Now, the title of this slide deals with the idea that we always start any design choice making from the outside and work in. It's amazing to me the number of organizations that I go to who start their design work from inside and then hope it applies outside. And yet the principle of designing from the outside in, we would often say, espoused much like design thinking might say it, if that will allow us to get breakthrough, because we are now no longer saying what can we do, what resources do we have, how can we best align them, but rather we're saying what do people choose us for, how can I build the muscles that will help me deliver a distinct and differentiated offer to those people, and then how do I best align my choices throughout the organization to deliver on that. That shift in logic from starting with what I've got on the right and working backwards, hoping it will connect to strategy, and instead starting with strategy and working to choices, is a fundamental way to think differently. And so I've worked with an organization who had a legal team that was highly decentralized, and so there were lots of attorneys and staff spread out throughout all the organization. And I'll get asked questions all the time about things like this. They'll say, is that a good design? Is that aligned? And, to have a decentralized legal team. And of course, my answer is going to be, well, it depends. What kind of muscle are you trying to build? Well, if you've decided you want to have world-class M&A capability, then you have to ask yourself, does a decentralized legal team help enable that? Some ways it could, in some ways it might not. You might be reinventing the wheel every time you run an M&A because the attorneys involved are going to be different. They don't run off the same playbook. They don't have the same experience and so forth. Now, how do we even know, is the muscle of M&A capability a good muscle to seek, and is a decentralized legal team the right way to align? Well, it all starts in the marketplace. It's what are you trying to deliver? In this particular illustration, which happens to come kind of from a med device standpoint, it's really the question of, do we offer the broadest diagnostic portfolio? If the answer is yes, then we better be able to invent and acquire lots and lots of different capabilities. And as we get those capabilities, then it becomes, do we have the legal support, the legal resources, the legal team, the legal processes necessary to deliver on that? And if we don't, then we have to make changes. This is a pretty basic concept here, but this shifting of starting with, is it good to have a decentralized legal team, and shifting it all the way to what are we trying to do in the marketplace, radically changes the set of questions and the way that an organization might answer these. So this is one of the first examples of how we shift mindsets. Now, again, I'm going to put out the reminder before I move to my next example here. If you have any questions or want to dialogue further, please chime in. But this is one example that happens at a fairly strategic level of organizations. And I want to now take us to a deeper level of where we see this happen. Now, look at this eye chart. This is pretty involved. This is actually an example of output from a work process redesign. So now we're down pretty deep in an organization looking at actual, work processes, business processes. And this one happens to deal with something around sales and go-to-market. Now, the reason I've put this up on the screen is because where we start the process of designing this makes a big difference.